I want you to remember this feeling, because it's the last normal thing that ever happened to me. I was sitting on the floor of my apartment, back against a wall that hadn't been painted since before I moved in, eating cold noodles out of the container because I didn't have the energy to find a fork. My phone was at 4%, my rent was late, and somewhere around 11 at night my heart just stopped, no pain, no warning, just the noodles falling out of my hand and the world going quiet. I remember thinking, in that last second, this is embarrassing, not scary. Embarrassing. 29 years old, dying alone on a floor, and the last thing I ever tasted was noodles that had gone cold an hour ago. Then there was nothing, and then there was a voice. Cold, flat, mechanical in a way that made my skin crawl before I even understood what it was saying. Transmigration successful. Host identity Adrian Vance. Role. Main villain. I opened my eyes to a ceiling I had never seen before, white high, with a chandelier that probably cost more than every apartment I'd ever lived in combined. Silk sheets. The smell of expensive cologne that wasn't mine. And when I sat up gasping, a mirror across the room showed me a face that wasn't my face. Sharp jaw, dark hair. Cold gray eyes that looked like they belonged to someone who'd never lost an argument in his life. I knew that face. I had read about that face. 6 months ago at 2 in the morning, unable to sleep, I'd read a novel called The Vance Legacy on my phone until my eyes burned. It was one of those billionaire family dramas. Old money, corporate warfare, a golden older brother, a scheming younger one, a love triangle that ended in tragedy. I remembered it because the villain's death scene had actually made me feel something which almost never happened with these stories. The villain's name was Adrian Vance. Second son, universally hated. Betrayed his older brother, destroyed his own family's trust, became obsessed with a woman who never wanted him, and in the final chapters lost everything, his name, his fortune, his family, and died alone in a rainstorm outside the very mansion I was apparently now lying in. I looked at my new hands, manicured soft, $100,000 watch on the wrist. No, I said out loud to the empty room. No, I knew exactly how this story ended. And I was now living inside the body of the man who was supposed to die in it. My first thought, my actual, honest, very reasonable first thought was simple. Okay, new plan, I don't do anything the book says. I stay in my room, I avoid my family, I avoid the girl, I avoid the drama, and I just quietly exist until this whole story runs out of steam. Easy. That's when the voice came back. Warning, host attempting to deviate from primary storyline. Deviation is not permitted. I froze. Excuse me, villain root active. Host must perform designated actions to maintain narrative integrity. First mission. Humiliate Alexander Vance at tonight's family dinner. Failure will result in immediate host termination. I stared at the ceiling like it owed me an explanation. I just got here, I said. I haven't even had coffee. I don't even know where the bathroom is. And you want me to humiliate a man I've never met or you'll kill me? The system didn't answer that. Systems, I would learn, only ever answered the questions they wanted to answer. Somewhere down the hall, a bell rang, soft and elegant, the kind of sound rich people use instead of yelling. A voice, a woman's voice, warm but tired in a way that suggested years of being tired, called out. Adrian. Dinner's in an hour. Please for once try to be presentable. I sat there in a dead man's body, in a life I never asked for, staring at a ceiling that cost more than my entire childhood, and I thought the only thing that made any sense. I am so unbelievably screwed. I had no idea in that moment that every single word I was thinking was about to become the most dangerous secret in that house. Chapter 1, the Vance estate sat on 11 acres of Long Island waterfront, the kind of property that didn't have a street address so much as a legend. Vance Global was a name that showed up on the news, on the sides of buildings, in the kind of headlines that made ordinary people nervous just reading them. I learned all of this in about 40 minutes, standing in a walk-in closet the size of my old apartment, going through Adrian's phone and trying not to have a breakdown. The system, apparently, had given me Adrian's memories in fragments, enough to know names and faces, not enough to feel like I actually belonged to any of it. Like watching someone else's home videos and being told they were mine. Richard Vance, father, founder of the empire. In every photo, he looked like a man who had personally never smiled and considered it a virtue. Victoria Vance, mother, elegant, warm-eyed, but with a tiredness around the edges that made me think of someone who had spent years hoping for something that kept not arriving. Alexander Vance, older brother, 32. The golden son, every photo of him looked like a magazine cover, controlled, composed, the kind of handsome that made you feel slightly inadequate just standing near it. Daniel Vance, younger brother, 24. The only one smiling in every single picture, which already told me more about him than any file could. And then there was Adrian's face, in the corner of a few old family photos, always a step apart from everyone else. Not because anyone had pushed him out, because he'd put himself there. What did you do to these people, I thought, staring at a photo of a much younger Alexander with his arm around a boy who wasn't smiling back. What did you do to make an entire family look at you like that? I didn't get an answer. I got a knock on the door instead. Sir, a voice careful like someone used to walking on glass. Dinner is being served. I looked at myself in the mirror one more time. Adrian's face looked back, unreadable, cold, exactly like the villain I remembered from the book. Okay, I told myself, new rule. I'm not going to become that guy. Whatever the system wants, I'll figure out a way around it. I am not going to die in a rainstorm outside my own house because a badly written novel said so. I had no idea how wrong I was about how much choice I actually had. The dining room looked like something out of a film, a table long enough to seat 20, though only 5 places were set. Crystal. Candlelight that felt less romantic and more like a courtroom. Richard Vance sat at the head of the table, already eating, already not looking at me. Victoria sat to his right, and her eyes found me the second I walked in, searching, careful, the way you look at a dog that's bitten you before. Alexander was already seated, a folder of papers beside his plate even at dinner, because apparently that was who he was. And Daniel, the younger brother, was the only one who looked up and grinned. Look who finally decided to grace us, Daniel said. Did the mirror finally forgive you, or are you just running out of things to be angry about? I sat down carefully, the way you sit down in a room full of landmines. Something like that. Victoria's eyes flicked toward me, surprised. I would learn later that something like that was, apparently, an oddly mild response for Adrian, who usually met Daniel's jokes with something sharper. And that's when I felt it, a pressure behind my eyes, a pull like a hand reaching into my chest. Mission reminder, humiliate Alexander Vance. Time remaining 14 minutes. No, I thought, gripping my fork. Absolutely not. I just met this man. I'm not doing this. Failure to comply will result in host termination. I don't even know what to say to him. What am I supposed to? And then, without my permission, without my control, my mouth opened. I saw the Kessler numbers, I heard myself say in Adrian's voice, cold and precise. Alexander's little project, the one he's been so proud of. My hand, not mine, but attached to me, set down the fork with deliberate, contemptuous slowness. It's going to fail. Everyone at the office already knows it. He's just the last one to figure it out. The table went silent. Alexander's jaw tightened just slightly. Excuse me, I wanted to take it back. I wanted to scream that I didn't mean a single word, that some invisible force had reached into my throat and used it like a puppet. But my body wasn't listening to me anymore. It kept going, delivering line after line about incompetence and nepotism, and how the family had been carrying Alexander for years. Each sentence landing like a slap across a face I had never even properly looked at yet. And the entire time underneath it, in the only place that still felt like mine, I was screaming, I'm so sorry, I don't mean any of this. There's a lunatic computer in my head threatening to kill me if I don't say it. Please, please don't believe a word I'm saying. You have no idea how much I don't want to be doing this. Richard's fork went down hard enough to make the crystal ring. Adrian, his voice was low, dangerous. That is enough. Alexander stood, chair scraping back, face carefully blank in the way of someone who has practiced not reacting for a very long time. I don't need to sit here for this, he said and walked out. Victoria looked at me like she didn't recognize her own son, which I supposed she technically didn't. And Daniel just watched me with narrowed eyes, not angry, not shocked. Curious. Like he'd noticed something none of the others had. I sat there, humiliated, guilty, furious at a system I couldn't see and couldn't fight, thinking the only thing I had left. I hate this. I hate every single part of this. Alexander, I am so sorry, you have no idea. Victoria's head turned toward me sharply. What did you say? She asked. I blinked. I didn't say anything. You did. Her voice had changed, not angry now, confused. Almost frightened. I heard you just now. You said you were sorry. My stomach dropped. I hadn't said that out loud. I was absolutely certain I hadn't said that out loud. Chapter 2, I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the edge of a bed that cost more than a car, running the dinner over and over in my head, trying to figure out what had happened. You heard me? I kept thinking, staring at nothing. You heard something I only thought. That's not possible. That's not okay, actually, given the circumstances. Not possible isn't really a phrase I get to use anymore. I decided it was a fluke. A slip of the tongue that I hadn't noticed. People misremember things. That was the only explanation that let me sleep even a little. I was wrong, and the next morning proved it in the most humiliating way possible. I found Richard in his study before 8, standing at the window with his hands behind his back. The posture of a man who had never once in his life needed to explain himself to anyone. Sit, he said without turning around. I sat. He turned finally and studied me the way you'd study a stock you didn't trust. Your mother tells me you apologized to Alexander last night. Silently? I don't know what that means, I said, which was at least honest. Neither do I, he crossed the room slowly. But it's not the first strange thing about you lately, is it? Please don't ask me anything I can't explain, I thought desperately. I don't know how any of this works. I don't even know how I got here. I just want to survive long enough to figure out the rules of my own life. Richard's eyes narrowed, sharpened, locked onto me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. I don't know how any of this works, he repeated slowly like he was tasting the words. You just said that. I didn't. You did, I heard it. Clear as anything. He leaned down, hands on the desk, his face inches from mine, and for the first time I saw something in Richard Vance's expression that wasn't cold. It was afraid. Adrian. What is happening to you? And that's when it hit me all at once like a bucket of ice water. They can hear my thoughts, not all the time, not perfectly. But somehow, someway, whatever the system had done to drop me into this world had left a crack, a leak, a door standing slightly open between my mind and theirs. Oh no, I thought, and immediately regretted it because Richard's eyebrows shot up. Oh no, he said flatly. You just thought that too, didn't you? I can see it on your face. I put my head in my hands. There was no point lying anymore. The evidence was standing right in front of him with a horrified expression. I think, I said carefully, that you can hear what I'm thinking, sometimes. I don't know how and I don't know why, and I promise you I am figuring this out in real time right along with you. Richard didn't answer immediately. He straightened, walked back to the window, and stood there for a long time in silence. Last night, he said finally, you humiliated your brother in front of this entire family. And yet you just told me, thought at me, whatever it is you're doing, that you were sorry, that you didn't mean it. He turned. Which one is the lie, Adrian? The words you say out loud, or the thoughts you think you're keeping private? I looked at him. This cold, terrifying man who I had read about as a footnote in a book, who I now realized was standing in front of me looking more lost than I had ever seen a billionaire look in my life. Honestly, I said, I think the thoughts are the only true thing about me right now. He studied me for a long moment. Then I suggest, Richard said quietly, that you be very careful what you think in this house. He had no idea how impossible that request actually was. Chapter 3. I tried. God, I tried. For 3 days I barely left my room, convinced that if I just avoided everyone, the system couldn't force me to do anything to anyone. It didn't work like that. Mission. Sabotage the Kessler contract Alexander Vance is finalizing this week. Failure will result in host termination. I stood in the middle of my closet at midnight, arguing with a voice only I could hear. That contract is worth $80 million, I hissed. If I sabotage it, the company loses money, people lose jobs, and Alexander looks like an idiot in front of the board. I am not doing that. Compliance is mandatory. Alternative, host termination. You keep saying that like it's supposed to scare me into obedience instead of just making me angrier. Correct assessment. Compliance is still mandatory. I spent that entire night doing something the system apparently hadn't anticipated. I complied and I didn't at the same time. I did sabotage the meeting, publicly, loudly in front of the board, exactly as ordered, playing every inch the reckless, jealous younger brother trying to tear down his golden sibling. But at 2 in the morning, using Adrian's login credentials and every scrap of business knowledge I'd absorbed from the fragments of his memory, I quietly rerouted the actual damage. I leaked a decoy version of the contract terms to the rival I knew Victor Hale's people would be watching for numbers that looked real enough to satisfy whatever the system was tracking, but different enough that the real deal stayed intact behind the scenes, buried in an encrypted folder only Alexander's assistant could access with the right password, which I made sure to send her anonymously. In the boardroom the next morning, Alexander's face was thunder. In front of everyone, he looked exactly as betrayed as the system needed him to look. But alone, going through the numbers afterward, he found the real deal untouched. Protected, saved by someone who had left no name behind. I sat in my room that night, exhausted, and thought, without meaning to broadcast it to anyone. If this contract falls into the wrong hands, the company loses $80 million and 40 jobs go with it. I'm not letting that happen even if I have to sabotage the sabotage myself. There was a knock at my door less than a minute later. Alexander stood there, the decoy contract in one hand, his real, untouched contract in the other, staring at me like he was looking at a stranger wearing his brother's face. You did this, he said, not a question, please don't ask me how, I thought, panicking. You just thought, please don't ask me how, Alexander said slowly. Mother told me about the thoughts. I didn't believe her, I sighed, all the fight draining out of me. Do you believe her now? Alexander stepped inside and closed the door behind him, which felt significant somehow, like a wall coming down half an inch. I don't understand you, he said. You spend the day destroying my reputation in a boardroom and the middle of the night saving my company. Which one is real? I looked at him, really looked for the first time. Not the perfect heir from the photographs. A tired man in his 30s who clearly hadn't expected kindness from this direction in a very long time. Both, apparently, I said. I don't have a good explanation. I just know I don't actually want to hurt you. I never did. Alexander was quiet for a long moment. Then why do it at all? Because a voice in my head threatens to kill me if I don't, I thought, and immediately clamped down too late. Alexander's eyes widened slightly. Kill you? I closed my eyes. I really need to learn how to keep my thoughts to myself. Adrian, his voice had changed completely now, no anger, just a kind of careful, dawning concern. What is actually happening to you? For the first time since I'd woken up in this house, someone was asking me that question and actually waiting to hear the answer, instead of already assuming they knew it. I didn't tell him everything. I couldn't. How do you explain transmigration and villain systems to a man who thinks in quarterly earnings reports? But I told him enough. That something was controlling my actions. That I didn't choose the things I said or did in public. That every terrible thing Adrian had done recently had a version of me screaming no underneath it. A version he apparently could hear sometimes whether I wanted him to or not. Alexander sat on the edge of my bed, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor for a long time. I spent 10 years hating you a little, he admitted quietly. Being angry that you seem to enjoy tearing this family apart. I don't know how to feel, knowing that might not have been a choice. I don't know how to feel about most of this either, I said honestly. But for what it's worth, I don't hate you. I never did. Whatever version of me existed before I got here, I inherited his mess, not his feelings. Alexander looked up at me, and something in his expression shifted. Not trust, not yet, but the very first crack of something that might become it. Don't make me regret this, he said, standing. I'll do my best, I said. No promises. There's apparently a murder-happy computer program actively working against me. Alexander almost smiled, almost. It was, I would later realize, the beginning of the only real brotherhood I had ever had. Chapter 4. I met Julian Blake on a Tuesday, at a charity gala I'd been forced to attend, wearing a suit that cost more than 3 months of my old rent, holding a glass of champagne I had no intention of drinking. He found me standing alone near the edge of the ballroom, which apparently was exactly where Adrian Vance was expected to be, too proud to mingle, too controlled to make a scene. Julian didn't look like most of the people in that room. He had the kind of confidence that didn't come from money, even though I'd later learn he had plenty of it. It came from somewhere else. You're not what I expected, he said, without introducing himself first. You're not the first person to say that to me this week, I said. He studied me, head slightly tilted, like I was a puzzle he was deciding whether to bother solving. I've heard stories about Adrian Vance, cruel, reckless, obsessed with tearing his own family apart for sport. His eyes narrowed slightly. You don't look like a man enjoying himself. Because I'm not, I thought, and then caught myself, glancing around nervously to make sure no family members were nearby to overhear the way they always seem to. I don't know you, I said out loud, carefully neutral. Julian Blake, he extended a hand. And you're about to find out that I notice things other people don't. I shook his hand, and something about the way he held my gaze steady, unimpressed by the room, unimpressed by the Vance name, made me instantly, uncomfortably aware that this man was going to be trouble in a way I didn't yet understand. For instance, Julian continued, releasing my hand but not looking away, I noticed you spent the last 20 minutes standing near the exit instead of working the room, which is exactly the opposite of what a status-obsessed man like Adrian Vance is supposed to do. Maybe I don't like crowds. Maybe. He didn't sound convinced. Or maybe the man everyone warned me about doesn't actually exist. If only you knew how right you are, I thought, and this time I caught it in time, mostly. Julian's eyes flickered just slightly, like he'd almost heard something he couldn't quite place, a word on the edge of hearing. What? I asked too quickly. Nothing, Julian said slowly, studying me with new interest. For a second there, it felt like you said something. I must be imagining things. Oh, you have no idea, I thought, and clenched my jaw before anything else could leak through. We talked for another 20 minutes that night, about business, about the city, about nothing important. And yet somehow it was the first conversation I'd had since arriving in this world that didn't feel like a performance or a battlefield. Julian was sharp, funny in a dry way that snuck up on you, and unfairly good at asking exactly the questions I didn't want to answer. I'll be seeing you again, Adrian Vance, he said as the night wound down, and there was something in the way he said it, not quite a threat, not quite a promise, somewhere thrillingly in between. I have a bad feeling that's true, I thought, watching him walk away. I also have an even worse feeling I don't entirely mind. Chapter 5. If Julian was a complication I hadn't expected, Claire Bennett was a mystery I had absolutely expected and gotten completely wrong. In the novel, Claire was the female lead. Sweet, gentle, endlessly patient with Alexander, the woman Adrian was supposed to become obsessively fixated on before losing his mind entirely and destroying everything around him trying to win her over. I had braced myself to meet a walking plot device. Instead, I met a woman sitting alone in the Vance family's private garden, reading a hardcover book with a pencil tucked behind her ear, radiating the specific energy of someone doing calculations that had nothing to do with romance. "You're Adrian," she said, not looking up. "I've heard a lot about you. All bad, I assume." "Mostly." She finally looked up, and her eyes were sharp in a way the book had never once described. "But you helped Alexander with the Kessler contract." Quietly, "He doesn't know I know that." I sat down across from her, cautious. "How do you know that?" "Because I've been watching this family very carefully for a long time," she said, closing her book. "Longer than you'd think. And I've noticed that a lot of things about the way this family's story is supposed to go don't actually seem to be happening the way they're supposed to happen anymore." My stomach turned cold. "What do you mean supposed to go?" Claire studied me for a long moment, weighing something. "You're going to think I'm insane." "Try me," I said. "I promise you my week has been stranger." "I don't think Alexander and I are meant to fall in love," she said quietly. "I think someone arranged for us to be pushed together. Every coincidental meeting, every dinner where we happened to be seated beside each other, every business deal that somehow required my presence at Vance events, I started keeping track. It's not coincidence, someone has been engineering this." "She knows," I thought, stunned. "She actually knows something's wrong with this story." "You just went very pale," Claire said. "Was it something I said?" "No," I said quickly, then reconsidered. This was, I realized, possibly the only person in this entire world who might actually understand what I was dealing with, or at least come close. "Actually, yes, I think you're right. I think someone's been controlling more than just you." Claire leaned forward, sharp interest replacing suspicion. "What do you know?" I told her carefully, testing the waters, watching her face for any sign she thought I belonged in an institution. Instead, the more I explained about a mysterious force pushing everyone toward a predetermined story, the more she nodded. Like pieces of a puzzle she'd been holding for months were finally clicking into place. "There's a man," Claire said finally. "Victor Hale, business rival of your father's. I've seen him twice at events where he had absolutely no reason to be there, both times, right before something happened that pushed Alexander and me closer together or pushed you into doing something reckless." She met my eyes. "I don't think he's just a rival businessman, Adrian. I think he's the one writing this." The name landed in my chest like a stone. I remembered it now, barely, a footnote from the novel I'd half-read on my phone at 2 in the morning. Victor Hale, a minor antagonist in the background of the story, always lurking at the edges, never fully explained. He knows the plot, I realized. He's not a character in this story. He's been manipulating it from outside, just like the system's been manipulating me. "We need to find out what he wants," I said. Claire almost smiled, the first real, unguarded smile I'd seen from her. "Welcome to my last 6 months of research, Adrian Vance. Glad someone finally believed me." Chapter 6. I finally saw Victor Hale in person 2 weeks later. At a business dinner, Richard had insisted I attend to start acting like part of this family instead of an embarrassment to it, which, given everything, felt almost sweetly optimistic of him. Victor was older, silver-haired, with the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. He shook my hand with exactly the right amount of pressure, the kind of handshake practiced 1,000 times in front of a mirror. "Adrian Vance," he said warmly, "I've heard so much about you." "Funny," I said, "I feel like I haven't heard nearly enough about you." Something flickered behind his eyes, brief but real, interest, maybe even respect. "You've changed," Victor said, studying me the way you'd study a chess piece that had just moved somewhere it wasn't supposed to be able to move. The Adrian I was told about wouldn't have said something like that. He knows, I thought, keeping my face perfectly still even as my pulse spiked. He knows I'm not supposed to be like this. Victor's smile widened, slow and cold. "You're wondering how much I know," he said quietly, leaning in so only I could hear. "The answer, Mr. Vance, is more than you'd like." He straightened, patted my shoulder like an old friend and walked away before I could respond, leaving me standing there with my heart pounding and a very clear, very unwelcome realization settling into my chest. He's not just manipulating the family. He knows about the system. He might even be the reason it exists. I found Claire later that night in the garden, and I told her everything. The look in Victor's eyes, the certainty in his voice. The sense that I had just been quietly, politely warned by a man who had absolutely no reason to fear a 29-year-old former villain wearing someone else's face. "We need proof," Claire said. "Real proof, or no one in this family is going to believe any of this, not your father, not Alexander, none of them." "They already half believe something's wrong with me," I said. "Isn't that a start? Believing something's wrong with you is different from believing there's a man secretly rewriting your family's entire life," Claire said. "We need to find out what Victor actually wants. Money, power, revenge. Something we didn't have to wait long to find out. 3 days later, the system gave me the mission that changed everything. Chapter 7, Final Mission, Betray the Vance Family. Cause the total collapse of Vance Global. Failure will result in host termination." I read the words hovering in my vision and felt something in me go very, very cold and very, very still. "No," I said out loud, alone in my room. "Absolutely not. Compliance is mandatory. I don't care, I'm not doing it." Host is reminded, refusal results in termination. Then terminate me, I said, and I meant it in a way that surprised even me. I would rather die than destroy the only family I've had since I woke up in this ridiculous life. Do your worst. The pain came almost immediately, a white-hot pressure behind my eyes, like something trying to physically claw its way through my skull. I fell to my knees, gasping, and somewhere in the haze of agony I heard footsteps, a door slamming open, Victoria's voice screaming my name. Adrian. I don't remember much of what happened next in order. I remember Victoria's hands on my face, her voice breaking. I remember Richard shouting for someone to call a doctor. And then, when I managed to gasp out the word system between waves of pain, I remember him going very quiet and very focused in a way that terrified me more than the pain did. I remember Alexander kneeling beside me, holding my hand so tightly it hurt, saying my name over and over like an anchor. And in the middle of all of it, in the one small clear space in my mind that the pain hadn't taken yet, I thought helplessly, honestly, with nothing left to hide behind. I'm sorry, I wanted to stay. I finally found people I actually wanted to call family, and I'm not even going to get to keep them. The room went silent. Victoria's hand tightened on my face. We heard that, she whispered, tears streaming freely now. Adrian, we heard every word. Richard's voice, when it came, was rougher than I had ever heard it. You are not going anywhere, he said. Do you understand me? Whatever this thing is, whatever it wants, it does not get to take my son, not again. Not again, I thought through the haze. What does he mean, not again? But there wasn't time to ask. The pain surged, my vision blurred, and the last thing I heard before the darkness took me was Alexander's voice, furious and unshakable, promising the empty air itself. We are not losing him. Chapter 8. I woke up 2 days later in a bed that wasn't the one I'd fallen asleep in a private wing of the estate I didn't know existed, with Richard Vance sitting in a chair beside me, looking like a man who hadn't slept in exactly as long. You're awake, he said quietly. Barely, I croaked. What happened? Richard was silent for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight I hadn't heard from him before, not the cold authority of a billionaire patriarch, but something older, sadder. 15 years ago, he said slowly, I had a business partner, brilliant man, warm in a way none of us in this industry are supposed to be allowed to stay. One day he changed, overnight became cruel, cold. Started making decisions that destroyed everything he'd built, everything the people around him loved. I thought I understood him one day, and the next I didn't recognize him at all. I stared at him, ice creeping down my spine. What happened to him? He died, Richard said simply. Alone, broken, everyone who loved him had already given up trying to understand what happened to him by the time it happened. He looked at me, and for the first time I saw real fear in Richard Vance's eyes. I've spent 15 years telling myself it was a breakdown, a tragedy no one could have predicted. I never let myself consider that something else might have been controlling him the way you've described this system controlling you. The pieces clicked together with a sickening weight. You think it happened before, I said. You think whatever's controlling me has done this to someone else. I think, Richard said very carefully, that I have spent 15 years investigating impossible things happening to people close to me and getting nowhere because I refused to believe the answer might be something I couldn't put in a spreadsheet. He leaned forward. Whoever, whatever is doing this to you, Adrian, it has done it before. And I intend to find out exactly what it is and exactly how to stop it before it takes anyone else from this family. I looked at this man, this cold, terrifying billionaire who I had once assumed hated his own son, and I saw instead a father who had been quietly, desperately fighting an invisible war for 15 years alone and never telling anyone. Thank you, I said quietly, for believing me. Richard's jaw tightened. Don't thank me yet, he said. We haven't won anything, we've only just found out what we're actually fighting. Chapter 9, it was Daniel, quiet, observant Daniel, who everyone underestimated because he made jokes instead of speeches, who found the answer none of us had thought to look for. He came into my room 3 days later holding an old file, his usual grin completely absent. I've been digging, he said, ever since the dinner where you accidentally apologized out loud. Something never sat right with me. You didn't act like Adrian, you never really have, not since that night. He set the file down on the bed. So I went looking at old medical records, Adrian's from years back. Before any of this villain nonsense started. I opened the file with hands that weren't quite steady. Inside were psychological evaluations, years old, buried, clearly meant never to be found. A teenage Adrian Vance, described by doctors as thoughtful, sensitive, quietly kind, deeply loyal to his older brother. Nothing like the cruel, obsessive villain from the pages I'd read on my phone at 2 in the morning. And then, dated almost 10 years back, a sudden, unexplained shift. A change in personality so abrupt one doctor had actually written the word unprecedented in the margins, followed by a question mark, followed by nothing. The file simply stopped, as if someone had decided the questions were too dangerous to keep asking. He didn't become the villain, I said slowly, understanding hitting me like cold water. Something made him into the villain, the real Adrian, the one before me. He was a victim too. Daniel nodded slowly. I think whatever's inside your head now has been inside someone's head in this family before. I think it took a kind kid and turned him into someone none of us recognized. And then, when it had used him up completely, it made sure the story ended with him dying alone so no one would ever ask questions. I thought of Richard's business partner. Of the file marked unprecedented. Of a system that spoke about villain roots and narrative integrity like human lives were nothing more than assets in a spreadsheet. It's not trying to make me into a villain because the story needs one, I said quietly, the realization settling into my bones like ice. It's manufacturing one, on purpose. Over and over in this family until it gets exactly the ending it wants. Daniel's face was pale. Then we're not just fighting for you, he said. We're fighting for whoever it decides to do this to next if we don't stop it now. For the first time since I'd woken up in this life, I didn't feel like an outsider wearing someone else's face, desperately trying to survive long enough to escape. I felt like I belonged to something worth fighting for. Chapter 10, Victor Hale made his move on a Thursday night, and he made it with the kind of confidence that only comes from believing you've already won. He arrived at the estate uninvited, flanked by 2 lawyers and a stack of documents that, according to Richard's furious explanation, represented a hostile takeover attempt 15 years in the making, old debts, buried contracts, leverage quietly gathered piece by piece, while the Vance family had been distracted by exactly the kind of chaos Adrian had been forced to cause. You've been very useful, Victor said to me, standing in the middle of the Vance family's own foyer like he already owned it. Every scandal, every family fracture, every moment this family spent distrusting each other instead of watching their company, I was there, collecting the pieces. You knew about the system, I said, forcing my voice steady. You've known this whole time. Victor's smile was thin and pleased with itself. I've been working with it for years, Mr. Vance. Every generation this family produces someone kind enough, someone loved enough, that breaking them apart creates exactly the chaos I need. Your predecessor, will call him, served his purpose beautifully once. I simply arranged for the story to repeat. Richard's face had gone the color of ash. 15 years, he said, voice shaking with barely controlled fury. You did this to him 15 years ago too. And I would have done it to this one without complaint, Victor said, nodding at me, if he'd simply followed the script like he was supposed to. His eyes narrowed. You've caused me a great deal of trouble, Adrian, or whoever you actually are underneath that face. He knows I'm not really Adrian, I thought, and didn't bother hiding it anymore. There was no point. Then it's about time, I said, that someone finally wrote you out of this story. Victor laughed, cold and genuinely amused. You're welcome to try, but I already have the paperwork to dissolve this family's control of Vance Global by morning. Whatever fight you think you're putting up, Mr. Vance, it's 15 years too late. That was when Alexander stepped forward, holding up a single folder of his own, and for the first time since I'd met him, I saw the golden air look genuinely, dangerously calm. Actually, Alexander said, it's not. Chapter 11. It turned out that while Victor had spent 15 years quietly gathering leverage, the Vance family, without ever fully understanding why, had spent that same 15 years quietly protecting itself. Richard's decades of paranoid investigations into impossible events had produced, alongside dead ends, an enormous amount of legal and financial armor nobody but him had known existed. Alexander's obsessive, meticulous control over every contract Vance Global signed meant Victor's buried leverage had far fewer weak points than he'd counted on. And the real, untouched Kessler contract I'd secretly protected weeks earlier turned out to be the exact deal that gave the family the liquidity to fight back without flinching. Claire brought 6 months of her own careful documentation, every suspiciously convenient meeting, every manipulated coincidence, evidence that painted a damning picture of a man who had been orchestrating a family's private tragedy for his own financial gain. Daniel, working through contacts nobody expected the funny one to have, tracked down 2 of Victor's former associates willing to testify about exactly how the 15-year-old, unprecedented, personality collapse in Richard's old business partner had actually happened. Pressure, manipulation, and something neither of them could fully explain that they'd simply called the program. And Victoria, quiet, warm, endlessly underestimated Victoria, turned out to know every person of influence in that city on a first-name basis, and called in every favor she had ever been owed to make sure that by morning, Victor Hale's reputation was in far worse shape than the Vance family's ever had been. By dawn, Victor's lawyers had quietly withdrawn. His documents, once so threatening, dissolved into legal irrelevance against a family that had, for the first time in 15 years, finally understood what they were actually fighting and fought it together. Victor stood in the foyer as the sun came up, his composure finally completely cracked. This isn't over, he said, but even he didn't sound like he believed it anymore. It is for you, Richard said quietly. Get off my property, Victor. And pray I never find enough evidence to put you away for what you did to my friend 15 years ago. Because if I do, no amount of money is saving you. Victor left. He didn't come back, but somewhere deep in my chest, in the place where the system's cold voice usually lived, I felt something stir, furious, desperate, and very much not finished. Host has disrupted primary antagonist function, recalculating narrative parameters, final directive engaging. I understood with a sinking heart that defeating Victor Hale had never been the real ending. The system itself was still coming for me. Chapter 12. It hit that night worse than anything before, not a mission this time, not a demand. Just pain, endless and total, like the system had decided if it couldn't use me anymore, it would simply erase me instead. I collapsed in the middle of the family sitting room, and this time all of them were there. All four of them around me holding on. Host has failed to complete narrative function. Initiating termination sequence. No, I thought, fighting through waves of white-hot agony. No, I refuse. I didn't survive a broken heart and a body that wasn't mine, and a family I never expected to love just to lose it all to a program that thinks people are disposable. I heard Victoria sobbing my name. Felt Alexander's hand crushing mine, refusing to let go. Heard Richard, voice breaking for the first time in 15 years, saying words I never thought I'd hear from him. "You are my son," Richard said, kneeling beside me, gripping my shoulders. "Whatever happened before you got here doesn't matter anymore. Do you hear me? You are my son, and I am not losing another one to this thing." Another one, I thought, through the pain, understanding finally, completely. He's not just talking about me. He's talking about who Adrian could have been all along if the system hadn't taken him first, and in that single clear thought, buried under everything else, I finally understood the thing Claire had been circling for months, the thing the system's cold logic had never planned for. The story, the original novel, the predetermined fate, all of it, had never accounted for a family choosing to fight for the villain instead of destroying him. The system's power came from the story staying on its rails. From everyone playing their assigned role, golden heir, disappointed father, cruel villain, tragic ending. It had never once accounted for the possibility that the villain might, somewhere along the way, become someone worth saving, and that the family might actually choose to save him. I choose you, I thought, as clearly and deliberately as I had ever thought anything in my life, pouring every ounce of will I had left into it. Not the story, not the ending you wrote for me. I choose this family, and there is nothing you can do about it, because that was never a choice you were allowed to make for me in the first place. The pain broke like a wave hitting a wall. Error, host deviation exceeds recoverable parameters. Narrative authority, failing, system, unable to enforce villain route. The pressure in my skull shattered all at once into silence, real silence. Complete, empty, blessed silence, for the first time since I had woken up in this house. I opened my eyes to four faces staring down at me, terrified, hopeful, exhausted. "It's gone," I whispered. "I think it's actually gone." Victoria broke down completely, pulling me into her arms. Alexander's forehead dropped against my shoulder, his breath shaking. Daniel let out a laugh that was half sob. And Richard Vance, cold, terrifying, unshakable Richard Vance, put a hand on the back of my head and held on like he was never planning to let go again. "You're staying," he said, voice rough. "Do you understand me? Whatever you are, whoever you are, you're staying, and you're ours." For the first time since a bowl of cold noodles and a quiet apartment and a heart that had simply stopped beating, I let myself believe that might actually be true. Chapter 13, months passed, and life at the Vance estate slowly, gradually became something I never expected to have again, normal. Not the normal of my old life, alone in a cheap apartment with cold noodles and unpaid rent. A different normal, a louder one, a warmer one. Alexander and I became, against every original page of that novel, genuinely close, the kind of brothers who argued about nothing and meant every word of the apology afterward. Daniel appointed himself my personal comedian, determined to make up for every joke Adrian had never let anyone make around him. Victoria hugged me every single morning like she was making up for years she couldn't get back. And Richard started slowly to smile, in a way none of the old photographs had ever captured. Claire and I stayed close, two people who had found each other in the middle of an impossible story and refused to let go of the friendship it had built, even after the mystery was solved. She eventually found her own path, entirely her own, with no novel and no system dictating a single page of it, which felt to both of us like the best ending she could have ever gotten. And Julian kept showing up, sharp and observant, and unfairly good at making me laugh when I least expected it, slowly becoming something I hadn't let myself hope for since I'd woken up wearing another man's face. It wasn't sudden, it wasn't a novel's idea of romance, rushed and predetermined, it was slow and real and entirely wonderfully our own choice. "You know," Julian said one evening months later, sitting beside me on the terrace as the city lights came up over the water, "when I met you I thought you were the strangest man I'd ever encountered." "High praise," I said. "I mean it as one. He looked at me, steady and warm in a way that still caught me off guard sometimes. I've never met anyone who fought that hard to become someone completely different from what everyone expected of him. If only you knew exactly how different I thought and caught myself waiting out of old habit for someone to hear it. No one did. The silence in my own head these days belonged only to me. What? Julian asked, noticing my small, private smile. Nothing, I said. Just enjoying having a thought that's actually mine. 6 months after Victor Hale's empire finally collapsed under the weight of its own decade of secrets, I sat at the Vance family dinner table on an ordinary Tuesday night, and it was, gloriously, completely unremarkable. Daniel was mid-argument with Alexander about something ridiculous. Whether a golden retriever could technically be considered a business asset if Vance Global adopted one as a mascot. Victoria was complaining fondly about Richard's inability to leave his phone in another room for even one meal. Richard was pretending not to be listening, and failing, badly, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Julian sat beside me, quietly amused by all of it, his hand resting easily against mine under the table. I looked around at all of them, this family I had once been terrified of, once been forced to hurt, now impossibly, completely my own, and thought without a hint of fear. I could get used to this. And then, faint and unexpected, a familiar cold flicker crossed the edge of my vision. System detected. I froze. Every fork at the table paused halfway to every mouth. 4 pairs of eyes turned toward me, instantly alert, instantly ready to fight whatever needed fighting. A single line of text hovered in front of me, quieter now, smaller, the last faint echo of something that no longer had any real power left. Congratulations, host. You have successfully deviated from the villain route. New storyline available. Would you like to proceed? I looked at it for a long moment. Then I looked at my family, at Alexander, ready to stand and fight anything on my behalf all over again. At Daniel, already reaching for something to throw at an enemy he couldn't even see. At Victoria's hand finding mine under the table. At Richard's expression, steady and unshaken, silently promising that nothing ever again would take his son from him without a war. At Julian watching me with quiet, complete faith that whatever came next I would choose it myself. I smiled. Absolutely not, I thought, closing the message for good. I already had every story I ever wanted. The end.